Remember, when we talk about church tradition, that includes the early church fathers. So in our case, we're particularly interested in Hippolytus and Eusebius, or Eusebius. In 180 AD, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, says that John was the author of the Gospel of John. So this is pretty early, 180 AD. There might have been documentation before that associated John with the Gospel of John, but it's lost. So we can say the earliest still existing document that connects the Apostle John with the Gospel of John is 180 AD in Irenaeus' best-selling work called Against Heresies. John, a disciple of the Lord who also had leaned upon his breast. So what is this doing here? It's also connecting the disciple that Jesus loved with John also. So this is where, hopefully, you're seeing where these traditions came from. Did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. John writes his magnificent gospel. Eusebius, in his best-selling History of the Church, was published in 325 AD at the request of Constantine the Great. He talks about why John wrote his gospel. Because there's always that question, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a lot in common between them. And then there's John. And the Gospel of John has a lot of different stories in it than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The wedding at Cana, for example. The only place that's recorded is in the Gospel of John. It's a much more spiritual gospel. It's much less interested in, it's not Luke. If Luke was interested in recording facts and figures and data, John was interested in spirituality. But here's what Eusebius said. He said, Matthew and John have left us written memorials. And they, tradition says, were led to write only under the pressure of necessity. When Mark and Luke had already published their Gospels, they say that John, who had employed all his time in proclaiming the Gospel orally, finally proceeded to write for the following reason. The three Gospels already mentioned, having come into the hands of all and into his own too, they say that he accepted them and bore witness to their truthfulness. So John was cool. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I'm cool with that. Everything's fine. I don't really like that Sons of Thunder bit, but the rest of it, they're fine. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's great. But that there was lacking in them an account of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. And so John writes this magnificent gospel. He does fill in some early blanks, like the wedding at Cana. He does give a slightly different version of at what point the apostles understood that this was the Son of God they were dealing with. It's very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I think that's wonderful. Today, scholarly opinion today, which along with $2 will buy you a cup of coffee, I understand that. But scholarly opinion today is that Mark was the first gospel written, then Matthew and Luke were second, and John was the last one. The argument is this, and I'm not saying the argument is right, and there's definitely a part of the argument I don't agree with, but the argument is this: Mark's the shortest gospel. It hasn't been embroidered in the opinion of current church scholars. So that was the first one, because Luke and Matthew took chunks out of it and put it into their gospel. But then the argument is there must have been another gospel, a now lost gospel, because there's material in Luke and Matthew that's not in Mark, but it's the same between Luke and Matthew. So this gets into the whole idiocy of the Gospel of Q, which is some scholars today talk about, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Q, as if it's a proven fact. There is no evidence whatsoever for a lost Gospel of Q. if there had been a lost gospel, it would have been mentioned by Irenaeus or Hippolytus or Eusebius. Oh, there was this wonderful gospel, but it's now lost. So there's no evidence at all. But that's the argument today. By tradition, John was also the author of 3 letters in the New Testament and the Apocalypse or Revelation. I'll give you a moment to admire the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse from the book of Revelation. It's not quite as robust when Joe's not. Eusebius was pretty sure about John 1. He assigned that to the Apostle John. He was less sure about John 2 and 3, and he wasn't at all sure about Revelation. Here's Hippolytus. So here's the old John. Oftentimes when John is depicted, he's depicted as the teenage boy who was around when Jesus is around. Well, here he is on the island of Patmos. He's an old man, and he's been exiled there by, who was it, Domitian, one of the nutbag Roman emperors. And so he figures, well, it's like Martin Luther. When Martin Luther went into exile, and he didn't have anything to do. So he thought, I'm just, since I have all this time on my hands, I'm going to translate the Bible into German. And of course, that's what really starts the Protestant Reformation. Well, it's the same here. John is banished to Patmos by the emperor. He has all this time on his hand, and he says, there's this stuff, these visions I keep having. Maybe I need to start writing them down. So John again in Asia. By Asia, he's talking about Turkey. He's not talking about Thailand. Was banished by Domitian the king on the island of Patmos, in which also he wrote his gospel and saw the apocalyptic vision. And in Trajan's time, he fell asleep at Ephesus, where his remains were sought for, but could not be found. So even back then, they weren't able to find his remains. As Peter was at least the spiritual leader of the early church, the guy that everybody clung to, John was the spiritual leader of the later church. Peter and Paul, both dead, mid-60s. And here's John, 30 years later, tottering around Patmos and writing down these visions that he's been receiving. Eusebius records that John outlived Domitian, which of course there's some irony to that. Domitian banished him and John outlived him. The Emperor Domitian began his rule in 81 AD and died in 96 AD. So if John really did outlive Domitian, that means John didn't die until kind of the latter part of the 90s. Is that possible? Sure. If Jesus started his ministry in 30 AD or 33 AD, whichever figure you prefer, and John was 15, John was a teenage boy in 30 AD, could he still have been alive in the 90s? Mm-hmm. Sure. Eusebius records a tradition from Apollonius that John raised a man from the dead at Ephesus. So in the New Testament, we have Peter and Paul both raising people from the dead. Eusebius records a tradition that John too did it. And this is St. John's Monastery on Patmos.